Good afternoon. Welcome to a virtual Bible study. Our topic today is Revelation, and we'll cover this for the next several weeks. I don't know how long we'll go exactly. I haven't really thought through the entire progression of the book. But one thing I do know is that the book of Revelation is best understood if you go fast. Of all the books in the Bible, the book of Revelation is one where it really is possible to get caught in the weeds, to lose sight of the forest because all you see are the trees. A lot of details, a lot of symbols, and it's possible to get so caught up in trying to interpret every little detail that you miss the point of the book. Which, just to tip my hand, the subtitle of this particular study is Revelation, Hope in Chaotic Times. And ultimately, that's what Revelation is for. So I'm going to start today by setting you an assignment for the week. And your assignment for the week is this. Read the book of Revelation, chapter 1 to chapter 22, beginning to end, in one sitting. In my Bible, it's about 17 pages. I would think that that means about an hour's reading for most people. Depends how fast you read. Some might do it faster, some slower. I don't really know. I never time myself reading it, but I would think an hour, hour and a half would be sufficient. But it really is very important to read it all the way through so that you sort of get the overall movement of the book. And you have to sort of bust on through the middle chapters, chapters 6 through 20, with all those visions. Just push on through so that you see what it does from beginning to end. All right, so that's your assignment at the outset. Today, I'm going to sort of set the table for what the book of Revelation is about. If we were live and we were to poll you about your impressions of the book of Revelation and what you know about the book of Revelation, we would have a lot of different things. Yesterday in my in-person Bible study, a lot of folks talked about just the weirdness of the imagery and some of the terror that brings, the way it sort of fascinates and yet disturbs. If we think about what we think we know about the end of the world, though, we find that we come into a place where we have a lot of voices in the world around us, and therefore we have a lot of weird opinions out there. And it's been this way forever. A lot of weird opinions out there. As long as the church has existed, there have been people who have been alternatively fascinated and disturbed by the book of Revelation. And a lot of times we categorize the weird opinions out there under the category of millennialism. So a millennium, obviously, is just 1,000 years, right? We know that. A lot of us lived through the year 2000, the coming of the millennium. So millennialism really focuses on Revelation 20, where there's a vision in which Satan is bound for 1,000 years, and then he's released before his final destruction. And there's lots of things that go around with this. Some see the millennium literally, some see it metaphorically. There's a movement called Post-Millennialism, not really very prominent anymore in our society, but certainly was very prominent in the 19th century, so the 1800s, especially in Europe. Europe was in the throes of great advancements. Technology was going gangbusters. They were understanding the world better than they ever understood it. It was a scientific revolution. And they were attracted to this idea that said there'll be this golden age when Christ comes to the nations and everyone is evangelized. And at the end of that golden age, there'll be this moment of trouble, but then Christ returns and settles it. Now, those sorts of really optimistic views of the future, utopian views, well, in Europe at least, they died an ugly death around World War I, which was not quite such an adventure for Americans, but for Europe, dragged on and on and on and just brutal warfare and loss, and really destroyed some of the optimism of European society. So we don't hear much about post-millennialism anymore, that there'll be this golden age of Christ and coming to the nations before things finally come to their culmination. It's a historical interest. Premillennialism, though, that's different. Premillennialism basically says there's going to be trouble beforehand, and Christ is going to reign sort of for an interim of 1,000 years, and then the destruction. And the place that this is really seen is in what's called dispensational premillennialism. That's a big mouthful. But this is the stuff that gets all the press. This is the stuff that's out there. Years ago now, 10, 15 years ago, they made movies out of a series of books called Left Behind. And as you can, sort of infer from the title, Left Behind is all about what people call the rapture, that God will take Christians out of the world before the really bad stuff happens, which is not a biblical idea at all. So you hear talk of rapture, you hear talk of Antichrist. And when they talk about Antichrist, they're taking passages from 2 Thessalonians, and they're taking passages from Revelation, and they're taking passages from the Gospels, and they're kind of mushing them together as if they're all talking about this one terrible figure who's identified with one of the beasts in Revelation. And that again is this just hooey, but it's out there, right? So rapture and Antichrist and great tribulation, all these things are out there in this sort of scheme. And it really can be off-putting. It's a little terrifying as they focus on all these things. I remember as a child, I had a comic book called, it was based off of Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, and it was full of these pictures of terrible things happening. It was enough to give a child nightmares. Now, we Lutherans, and honestly, most sensible interpreters of Revelation, are what we call amillennialists. And we have a much different take on the millennium than all of that does. And we'll come to that in due time. So as we think about the book of Revelation, there's a lot of sort of crazy stuff out there that we have to be aware of. So as we start coming to the book of Revelation, the first thing we have to look at, honestly, is the title itself. And this is important. I mean, this sounds silly, but it's important. The book is not called Revelations. It's not plural. It's singular. Revelation. Why is that important? Well, it's important, I suppose. If it's Revelations, it plays into that idea that it's a book full of visions about the future. It kind of is a misunderstanding of the title that plays into the premillennial dispensationalist misunderstandings, right? That this is a book that's supposed to be here to help us figure out what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And again, that's simply not what the book is for. No, the book is called The Revelation of Jesus Christ. It might be a revelation of Jesus Christ. It's a little ambiguous there, and there's some things we could go into that aren't really important. But here's the thing. What this book is about is the revealing of Jesus Christ. Now, different translations will take it differently. The translation I use translates it the revelation from Jesus Christ. That this is a showing and unveiling, a revelation that Jesus himself gives. And it certainly is. Jesus is a primary character, especially in the first and last chapters. It could also be a revelation about Jesus Christ. That would also be a legitimate translation. And it's certainly that too, because there is a lot of Jesus in here. He's pictured much differently than we're used to. This is not the guy with the faraway eyes of Jesus of Nazareth. This is, not the troubled soul of the passion of the Christ. No, this is a powerful Jesus portrayed in very different kinds of ways. But the book really is ultimately all about Jesus. So those are important things to think about just in the title. What are we supposed to expect when we read Revelation? Well, it's not about clues to the possible future. It's not revelations. It is instead specifically the unveiling of Jesus Christ, as he shows what's going on in the world and as he himself is shown in the book in his power and glory. So the title here is very important. Another thing that is very important is a thing that we would call genre. You see that on your screen there, genre. Genre is about the question, what am I reading? And it's an important question, even if we never think about it, because we have different kinds of reading strategies for different kinds of literature. We know the differences. If you're a person of a certain age, you learned how to read a newspaper. Now, I know newspapers are kind of on the way out, but work with me here, right? The idea of a newspaper is there's a headline, and the headline is just enough to sort of tell you what the story's about. You could read the headlines and have a pretty good picture of what's going on that day. You could also read the first paragraph of every story, the lead, because you know that that's the summary point, right? That's the point where the high points are. So if you read the headline and the lead of every story, you'd have a really good idea of what's going on in your world that day. And if you want more details, you read the article and then you flip the page to page 2, and there's the rest of the article. We know instinctively what a newspaper is for. And we know that there are certain tricks that we can use to read it appropriately. We don't have to read the whole thing cover to cover. As a matter of fact, if we did, we'd get confused because, you know, the articles are separated in different pages. But we know the genre of newspaper. We know the genre of encyclopedia. Now, admittedly, my sister and I were weird. Well, I'll grant that. But very few people beyond my sister and I will sit down with the encyclopedia and just say, all right, letter A, let's read it from the beginning to the end. It's not a novel. You don't have to read it beginning to end, right? It's not how it works. You look up the article you're looking for, and there's the information that you need. And maybe at the end of the article, there's some cross references to other articles and other volumes that would give you more information related to the topic. So we know how to read an encyclopedia. We know how to read a biography. We anticipate that a biography is going to be based in fact, all verifiable historically, that it's going to start with childhood, lead through accomplishments, and end with death. This is how we know to read a biography. We know if we're reading a historical novel, we read it differently because there we know that it's been fictionalized. Things have been added to it. 25 years ago, I forget when, a very prominent historian named Edmund Morris wrote a biography of Ronald Reagan entitled Dutch. Now, Morris had been the White House historian during the Reagan years. He had access. And people expected, because of his reputation, a straightforward biography. But one of the things that Morris did was he inserted himself as a character in Reagan's childhood, before Morris was even born. And he took the genre of biography and he twisted it just enough with this literary device of way to tell the story that people were very confused and very angry. They didn't know what were they reading. Is this biography? Is this history? Or is this historical fiction? Morris's response was that was all detailed in the footnotes. But honestly, very few people read the footnotes. So it was kind of a problem. So the question of genre, what am I reading here? And with Revelation, we have 3 answers. The first answer is that we are reading what is called apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is the same word that's in the title of Revelation. So in Greek, this is the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. Now, apocalyptic is a style of literature with a long history. It has its birth, it has its roots actually way back in Israel's prophets. There are portions of Ezekiel that are sort of like the beginnings of apocalyptic, fantastic visions of angels shaped like beasts and God's heavenly chariot, his heavenly throne being carried around. Zechariah has a number of visions like this in the second half of his prophecy. So all the way back 600 years, 500 years before Jesus, we start to see this sort of different style of prophecy with very graphic images and highly symbolic presentations growing up. Of course, the book of Daniel is very much that way. This summer, Pastor Hauser and I preached through some of the post-exilic books. And with Daniel, we dealt with the fun parts, right? We had the three men in the fiery furnace. We had Daniel in the lion's den, but we didn't preach on the fantastic images in Daniel. So a long history in the Bible, and it comes to sort of full fruition in the period between the Testaments. There are a number of apocalypses from Jewish sources. The most famous of which is one called First Enoch. Actually consists of, I lose track, a bunch of different visions, and probably written over the course of 200 or 300 years, but very well known in the period between the Testaments. It's not like this thing was just done in a corner. Instead, lots of people knew of it and were familiar with it. It was very influential. And then in the Christian era, there are apocalypses as well, aside from Revelation. There's one called Fourth Ezra, and as I'm saying that, I forget if that was of Jewish or Christian origin, but it was certainly from the Christian era. And among Christians, there's one called the Shepherd of Hermas, which was well circulated, widely thought of, included in some very early collections of the books of the Bible. So there's this long history of apocalyptic literature. And the reason that matters is if you're going to understand the book of Revelation, you have to sort of track with the rest of the apocalypses that lead up to it. Because the apocalypses have recognized characteristics. There are these things that set them apart. The first and foremost of those is that they are filled with highly symbolic imagery. Just as an example, we'll use numbers. Numbers are all over these apocalypses, and it's not a mysterious code. It's actually fairly straightforward. 3 is a number associated with God. 4 is a number associated with the totality of the earth, the 4 corners of the earth. 7 is the divine number. It's associated with God in all sorts of ways. You kind of see it in a 3 plus 4, right, kind of thing. That's 7. 10 is a number of earthly strength and earthly might. So 10 and its multiples are significant. 12 is a number associated with Israel, with God's people. So just as an example, we'll come to this again, obviously later. But the number 144,000 is very prominent in the book of Revelation. Well, you just think about that. It's 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. So it is the fullness of God's people, 12 times 12, in the fullness of power, 10 times 10 times 10. And you don't need to go any deeper than that. It's just a way of saying this is the fullness of God's glorified people. That's it, right? You know the code. There are other codes. Colors will have some significances. We'll talk about that at the appropriate time. A lot of beasts. So yeah, beasts were a way of, it wasn't about zoology so much. It was a way of talking about and characterizing earthly powers. So you described them as bestial, and they were ravenous, and they were dangerous, and they would consume you. So there's imagery there of beasts, which often stand in for the empires and powers of the earth. Anyhow, the point is, there's a long history, and that long history tells us what some of the code is of these fantastic images, which is probably the element of apocalyptic that most people notice most often, I would think. So it is got recognized characteristics. These fantastic images, for example. Another thing that often occurs in these apocalypses is that they are mediated from heaven to an earthly observer by means of angels. So it's in this literature that we often discover something about what we call angelology, the doctrine of angels. It turns out that a lot of what we think we know about angels, we don't know, not from the Bible. The Bible has precious little to say about angels. It names Gabriel as an angel, as an archangel, I believe, in Luke, if I recall correctly. Michael is named as an angel. That's in the book of Daniel for sure. Satan is named, but whether or not he's considered an angel in the Bible is a different kind of thing. Revelation kind of leads us to think he is. But you hear about other kinds of demons and other kinds of angels. I don't know, you hear of the angel Raphael, you hear of the demon Azael. A lot of these things that Hollywood often makes prominent, especially the demon names, come out of this literature, this apocalyptic literature from the intertestamental period. I actually used to play a video game called Diablo, which obviously is Spanish for devil, and all the bosses in this video game were named after demons, Mephistopheles, right, Mephisto, and these again are names that come out of this sort of intertestamental stuff. So a very prominent angelology. That's the case in Revelation too. The author of Revelation often is talked to by angels. What's different here is that God's voice and Christ's voice are always really very close at hand. So God is not sort of off in his heaven hidden, but he also is unveiled, speaks. So a lot of fantastic imagery. And sometimes I think with the fantastic imagery, we say, well, how do you interpret that? And the answer is you go to the long history of apocalyptic. A lot of angelology in there, which kind of makes us say, let's be careful about what we say we know about angels, because we might not know that much about angels. Other things that mark it. A lot of this literature is marked by a deep dualism, good and evil, light and darkness. And Revelation has some of that going on too. It's pretty clear through Revelation that you need to choose sides. Actually, in one of the easiest parts of the book, in the letters in chapters 2 and 3, Jesus actually criticizes the church, I think it's of Laodicea, for being neither hot nor cold. They're just tepid. And he says, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. It's a little more graphic than that, but we'll come to that in a week or two. So dualism, light versus dark, good versus evil, the powers of God versus the powers of the devil. The one thing that is abundantly clear in the book of Revelation is that the powers of the devil are never equal to the powers of God. There is a theme that runs all the way through the book that God is actually in control of this whole thing. And we'll see that evidence as we go through the book in a little more detail later on. So again, known characteristics, recognizable characteristics, highly symbolic, very figurative language, very much involved with angels and angelology, a lot of dualism in there, although that's moderated a little book in the book of Revelation. The fourth thing to say about apocalyptic is that it has a known purpose. Apocalyptic is the literature of resistance. It's the kind of literature that is born out of an oppressed people. Now, I use this example on Wednesday, my in-person Bible study. No one had seen it really. But I reference the movie Blazing Saddles. It's a Mel Brooks comedy. It's a screwball comedy, and it's a satire of racial attitudes, but it uses language that a lot of Americans wouldn't be comfortable with anymore. But there's this scene, it kind of, again, playing into stereotypes. There's this scene where the white overseer of railroad construction comes upon a gang of workers who are black. And they got some complaints about working conditions. And the white overseer, and this is intentionally inflammatory, I'm sure that's how Brooks meant it, asks them and says, you boys used to sing those songs. And he's talking about spirituals, and he wants to hear one of their old cotton field spirituals. Well, the black people, because this is a Mel Brooks movie, they break out into "I get no kick from champagne," and then the overseers, no, like one of these. But if you think about the language of spiritual also is resistance literature. It's the language of the oppressed. So famously, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to take me home, right? The oppression's not going to last forever. It sounds like a fairly innocent song about the Bible, but it really is expressing a hope that oppression can't last forever. I've got shoes, you've got shoes, all God's children got shoes, goes a famous spiritual, sung originally by people who didn't have shoes, but they were looking forward to the kingdom of God coming among them. So African-American spirituals actually have a lot in common with this much older form of apocalyptic. How do you criticize the oppressor without him knowing you're criticizing him? Because if you criticize the oppressor, he's going to get angry and punish you. So you want to do it surreptitiously. You want to do it on the sly. And that's how you sort of cast a vision beyond oppression. In Revelation, for example, Revelation is probably written about 100 AD. It has literally been 600 years since Babylon was a world power when this book is written. Rome dominates the world. Rome's empire dominates from Great Britain in the west, all the way to Scythia in the east, and across the North African coast of the Mediterranean. I mean, Rome is the power, and Rome is never mentioned in the book of Revelation. But Babylon is. It's code, Babylon. And everyone knows who reads it, Babylon means Rome, and the beasts mean Rome. And it's a way of saying oppression can't and won't last forever. So again, as I said, known characteristics, recognizable characteristics that historians and interpreters can look back on. And that was about its purpose there. So it is apocalyptic in nature, and we have to sort of hold it against the background of those other apocalypses. We have to, at the very least, reference Ezekiel and Zechariah and Daniel for sure. And probably we have to have in the background some of these other books that you and I haven't read so carefully because they're not part of Holy Scripture. Now, that's not the only genre that we have to be prepared to find in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation also calls itself a prophecy. So we have to think here a little bit about prophecy. And here on your screen is a thing that is so important when understanding prophecy. So somewhere in the neighborhood of a third of the quarter of the Hebrew Old Testament is prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel fits in there, Hosea, all the 12 minor prophets. Primarily, they are not foretelling. Now, there are elements of each of the prophets that looks into an unknown future, right? So there's a forward-looking sense to them, but not in the sense of fortune telling, not in the sense of future telling, like, when should you buy lottery tickets or when should you sell your stock? It's not really that kind of literature. We sometimes think of it that way, but it's not really that way. I take it as just, again, fundamental, axiomatic, that every book of the Bible had to make sense for the people who originally read it. And if it's only ever forward-looking, then you're not quite getting it straight. Check the time here. A classic example is Isaiah 7. Many of us have probably never read Isaiah 7. It's where the famous, excuse me, I was distracted there. Isaiah 7, it's the famous, the virgin shall conceive passage. Now, in context of Isaiah 6, 7, and 8, what it's talking about is a time frame in which the Aramean Syrian threat will be gone. So the southern kingdom is under threat of invasion from its northern neighbors. The king is very anxious. And when Isaiah says the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, he's giving a 9-month time frame. And then he gives even a longer time frame a little bit later on when he talks about, the child sort of not knowing right from wrong yet, and these kings are completely gone. So in its original context, it's very much about 8th century BC Israel. Now, it shouts forward to Jesus, right? Because in Jesus, a virgin literally does conceive and literally does give birth to a son. But you only recognize its foretelling aspect in light of Jesus, once the fulfillment has come. So there is a future-looking sense of prophecy, but that's not primarily what it's for. Primarily, what it's for is what I've dubbed here forth-telling. Primarily, the prophets are trying to interpret what God is up to in the world as the people see it that day. So the work of the prophet is, in a lot of ways, similar to the work that I do, the work of a preacher. What is God up to in the world today? How can you understand the world in light of God's promises and in light of God's future? So it is a prophetic work, but again, we have to tamp down this idea that it's about the future. Very often, I'd even say most often, prophecy was first and foremost about the present. What is happening in the world right now, and how do we understand it appropriately? When we come to the visions in a couple of weeks, that's going to come up a lot, what it means that this is a prophetic book. Finally, it is also, it casts itself as an epistle, a letter. So there is a greeting and a salutation. Actually, chapters 2 and 3 are very much letters, right to the church of Sardis, right to the church of Laodicea, all these things. And the ending has some epistolary features. So in some ways, we also need to think of it in the same way that we think of the letters of Paul. So what is Paul doing in his letters? Well, he is instructing. So there is instruction here. And the instruction here is that part of it is kind of muted in Revelation. Although there is instruction about the nature and character of Jesus in these visions of Jesus. There is admonition in Paul's letters. In many of Paul's letters, after he instructs in the gospel, he admonishes to a certain kind of life. And one of the purposes of Revelation then is to admonish us, to say, live a certain kind of way. This is what the Christian does in God's world. And finally, Paul's letters, the other letters of the New Testament as well, act as encouragement to keep on going, to stay faithful. And certainly there's a lot of that in here as well. So it is apocalyptic in nature, it is prophetic in nature, and it is epistolary in nature. And we have to sort of account for all three of these things when we try to understand Revelation as it's really meant to be understood. So that is the bulk of what we have to deal with today. There's two other questions that we should deal with just at the outset. Number one is who wrote Revelation? And I would suggest that among most scholars today, well, it's a man named John. Okay, he self-identifies as John. And in most of the rest of the New Testament, the only John that's mentioned is John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. So historically, it was thought, well, of course, Revelation is written by the Apostle John, son of Zebedee. I think probably the vast majority of scholars today would say that Revelation is written by a different John, not John the Apostle, but a different John. Sometimes they dub him John the Divine, John the Theologian, and they think of him as an elder, a prominent elder in the area of Ephesus, but not the apostle. Sometimes they call him John the Seer. I guess, for my money, I understand the arguments back and forth. I don't see any reason this can't be John the Apostle. And I guess I just prefer to default to that position, that the author is John the Apostle, who walked with Jesus and understood Jesus. Read the beginning of 1 John, right? So you got the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and then the book of Revelation, I think all coming from the same mind, the same heart, the same pen. There's really nothing hanging on that all that much. I mean, it's Holy Scripture. That's all we need to know. Accepted by the church since ancient times. When it was written is an interesting story, though. So Israel, the church, in its earliest years, probably its first 30 or 40 years, when it was persecuted not by the Romans, but by fellow Jews. You read the book of Acts, and most of the trouble that the church has comes out of the synagogue. And that's because, as far as the Romans were concerned, Jews and Christians were just kind of the same thing. The Romans didn't delve too deeply into what the differences were. They just sort of saw this mass of people from the synagogue. So interestingly, was it Tacitus? I think it's Tacitus records during the reign of the Emperor Claudius in the late 40s. Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, from the city of Rome. And all the historian says, I think it was Tacitus, all he says is, on account of one Christus, which is pretty easily seen as a Roman misunderstanding about Christ. So from the Romans' point of view, you had this sort of inter-Jewish squabble about someone named Christ, and they weren't concerned about it. And he just said, "Y'all get out of here. Y'all get out of the city." You don't actually have persecution of Christians until the 60s, and two things happen. First of all, in the 60s, 66 to 70, there's the Jewish War. This is the great revolt of the Jews against Roman rule, and ultimately leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. At that point, it becomes good for Christians to separate themselves from Jews and say, whoa, we're not the guys you're fighting a war with. So the Jewish Civil War is a point at which Christians have to separate themselves for their own safety. The trouble is, once you start to separate yourself from Jews, you lose what were historic privileges that Jews had. So Herod the Great had done some favors for Julius Caesar, and Caesar had given Jews privileges in terms of freedom to worship their own kind of way, that Christians were able to piggyback on. And suddenly they started losing those things, and they started getting blamed for that. At the same time, mid-60s, you have a terrible fire in Rome. And best reconstruction is that the Emperor Nero said it because he wanted to clear out the slums and put in better housing. It was urban renewal. And he was shocked, I tell you, when the people whose houses were burned were not amused. So he blamed it on the Christians. And he launched a citywide persecution of the Christians. Very brutal stuff. Nero is followed by the Emperor Domitian. And Domitian reigns from 81 to 96. And he takes that sort of momentary persecution under Nero and he extends it. So it's not widespread. It's not empire-wide. It's here and there. It's from time to time. It's mostly in the city of Rome. But the church is starting to get their first sense of what it is to be a persecuted minority. So the reign of Domitian seems like the right time to place the book of Revelation. Why would they need an apocalypse? Except at a time when they're first having to figure out, wait a second, if we're God's chosen people, why is this going so badly for us? And it fits Domitian because the next emperor, Trajan, actually has a pretty hands-off approach to Christianity. So it's less important the history of the Roman Empire and more important to realize that probably Revelation was written at a moment when Christians were starting to stand out and be noticed for standing out, and we're starting to attract the kind of attention that no one wants. So it fits why there is an apocalypse written at the end of the first century. All right, so that's the presentation, that's the background on the book of Revelation. I think the thing to see is, number one, it's not as interpretively difficult as some people want to make it to be. There are keys and there are precedents for how we understand the book of Revelation. Incidentally, those don't have anything to do with the weirdness of pre-millennial dispensationalism. So we'll look at this book rooted in scholarship and history and see what its purpose is. But the purpose is pretty clear because it is an apocalypse. Its purpose is really to give encouragement and hope to a people who are feeling oppressed. And that's the title of the study then, Hope in Chaotic Times. We'll start to spell that out in terms of the actual text next week. Hope this was informative. Hope you enjoyed it. And I hope maybe that you can tune in live next week. Same time, same place, same codes and everything. I look forward to seeing you then. Okay. God's blessings. Bye-bye.